All right. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar on the 200s, also known as California's climate laws. As everyone trickles in, I'll just do some quick introductions. I appreciate you taking the time with us today to join us for this hour. There have been some updates since our last webinar for those of us who have been with us on this journey, and so we're going to be summarizing those today before opening it up to some Q&A. I'll introduce myself first before introducing my guests. My name is Natalia Pascual. I'm Agendi's West Coast lead, based in our San Francisco office, have over a decade of consulting experience with specialization in climate and sustainability, and serve as one of our California compliance and disclosure leads. I'm joined by my colleague Samantha, who is a senior consultant at Agendi and also based in our San Francisco office. She has over a decade of experience working as both a consultant for Fortune 500 companies as well as in-house championing emissions reductions efforts. And her journey has included roles with the World Economic Forum, DAI, the National Human Rights Council of Morocco, and the African Presidential Center at Boston University. And lastly, I'll introduce our guest speaker, Pedro Peterson, who manages a climate data reporting section at the California Air Resources Board, also known as CARB, which implements Senate Bill SB 253. Pedro has been a manager at CARB for 6 years, previously supporting local governments to align land use and transportation policies with the state's climate goals. Before joining CARB, he was a senior planner for the city of San Francisco and an independent consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C., and he holds a PhD in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley. Thank you both for joining me today. So, as far as what to expect today, my colleague Samantha will lead us through an overview of the 200s, the latest updates with that. I will walk us through a high-level action plan for compliance, and then we'll jump straight into an open audience Q&A for the remainder of the call. We're hoping to keep, 30 to 40 minutes for this, so please write your questions that you may have for us using the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Great. So I'll kick us off with a quick introduction about Agendi. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Agendi is a sustainability and climate strategy consulting firm with headquarters in North America, UK, and the EU. We serve over 200 global clients on a variety of different services, from course preparation for compliance with regulations like those in California through greenhouse gas inventories and climate-related risk assessments and disclosures, but also help clients with a wide array of other offerings like materiality assessments, target setting, transition plans, and carbon offsetting strategies. I'll quickly introduce CARB as well, although I believe most are probably familiar with CARB as an organization, but CARB is charged with protecting the public from harmful effects of air pollution and developing programs and actions to fight climate change. They have been tasked with developing the California Corporate Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program to implement SB 253 and the Climate-Related Financial Risk Disclosure Program to implement 261. They'll be participating in the Q&A portion of this webinar later on. Before we go into the content, I will emphasize something that Alexander put into the chat. The information that we're presenting today has not been reviewed, approved, or endorsed by CARB. All views and opinions expressed today are solely those of ourselves and do not represent the opinions or viewpoints of CARB. Great. I'll pass the remote to Samantha to walk us through the updates for 200s.
Yes, thank you, Natalia, and thank you all for joining us today. So I'm just going to do a very quick overview of the laws themselves and then some of the most recent things that CARB has been working on to hopefully preempt some questions or get the juices flowing on what questions folks might have for us when we get to the Q&A portion. So we've been referring to the 200s. That's kind of the affectionate nickname for the California Climate Accountability Package, which includes SB 253, SB 261, and SB 219. 253 and 261 are kind of the key pieces of legislation. So 253 being the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act and 261 being the Climate-Related Financial Risk Act. So I'm going to go over briefly, what goes into each of these pieces of regulation. So starting with the applicability of them. The two different pieces of regulation are um, looking at companies that are US companies with that are doing business in California that meet particular revenue thresholds. For SB 253, that's companies with revenues of $1 billion or more. And for SB 261, it's companies with revenues of $500 million or more. And then in terms of what each is asking for, the disclosure requirements underneath each one. 253 is looking at annual disclosure of your emissions across all three scopes and kind of a phased timeline that we'll talk about. And then SB 261 is looking at biennial disclosure of climate-related financial risks, really aligned to some commonly accepted frameworks like TCFD or ISSB. And then in terms of effective dates and kind of deadlines for SB 253, as mentioned, that is a phased approach where, for 2026, that is the first deadline where you would be reporting on previous year scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then add in scope 3, and then add in additional assurance requirements over time. For SB 261, that is the most pressing deadline. The first compliance deadline for that is January 1 of 2026. So that is right around the corner. So we have a lot of really good information in terms of what's written in the legislation, in terms of what's being asked for, and a lot to really work with already. In addition to what's in the legislation, as mentioned, CARB is tasked with working on rulemaking, especially as it relates to SB 253, and they've been very busy working on putting together guidance and materials and taking on board feedback to help make sure that companies have what they need to feel like they're able to be successful when they're working towards compliance. So I'm going to talk through just a couple of the things that CARB's been working on. There's too many, to be honest, to cover in a short time before we get to Q&A. And so I want to focus in particular on what's been going on in about the last 6 weeks to 2 months that CARB's been up to. I highly, highly encourage folks to go to CARB's website to see all the resources they've made available. There are recordings of their workshops. There are materials that they've used to kind of share information with folks. So again, really would direct folks there, but our kind of quick summary of what's gone on in the past 2 months or so is starting with early September. September 2nd, CARB released a draft checklist for SB 261 first year reporting requirements in particular. And so this checklist is really going to be useful for folks as they're thinking about what needs to be included in their first year reporting. And it outlines a little bit more information around, what companies can think about when they're thinking about what to include, and hopefully give folks a little bit more insight into that. So it specifies, what that folks should include, what standard they're disclosing against, what recommendations they're able to comply with, and a little bit more information around how to explain which recommendations you're not able to comply with, leveraging that comply or explain provision in the legislation. And then also clarifying that for first year reporting for companies where it's logistically difficult or not material, quantitative scenario analysis and GHG emissions disclosure are not required if not available. And that really, you don't need FY25 data for that. It's really about best available data, using the best information that you have and putting your best effort forward in order to comply, especially with this first year of reporting. Then we get to kind of the next update, which came out in later into September. On September 24th, CARB released their preliminary list of reporting covered entities. So this list is really useful in that it gives a lot of insight into how CARB is currently thinking through the fee regulation and understanding the number of entities that may be in scope. They outlined their kind of methodology for this really well in their August workshop. So again, highly encourage folks to take a look at that. But in particular, like high level summary, they looked at the California Secretary of State business entity database and cross-referenced that with some other data from Dun & Bradstreet around revenue to understand which entities may be in scope. I will note that being on this list does not necessarily mean you're in scope. Being off this list does not mean you're necessarily out of scope. This does not replace your own due diligence to determine whether or not your entity is in scope. We highly encourage folks engage their own counsel for this to understand, whether or not they're in scope. But this is really more to get a much better sense of how CARB is currently thinking about entities that may be in scope and kind of the way that they're thinking about that fee regulation. So if you have thoughts on this or feedback for CARB, there is a survey, a voluntary survey you can fill out to provide that feedback to them. And we, of course, encourage folks to fill that out as it makes sense. So then we get into some updates that came out just this month in October. And so on October 10th, CARB released a draft template for Scope 1 and Scope 2 reporting, as well as a memo to kind of go with that template to give a little bit more insight into its use. This draft template is really, really useful. It has a first tab that kind of gives you definitions and some key themes to keep in mind. And then instructions. And then that second tab has all the fields that CARB might be looking for in reporting your Scope 1 and 2 emissions to them for first year reporting. It's organized into a number of different sections that you can see here to give you a sense of kind of what's in there. I'm not going to go through all the data fields now, but ultimately, if you're working on your emissions accounting already, all the fields that are in there should be fairly straightforward and seem really familiar to you, hopefully. Nothing in there is asking for anything other than typical information you may have as it relates to your Scope 1 and 2 reporting and our experience working with clients. That currently has a public comment period that is open through Monday on October 27th. So again, going to encourage folks to prepare and provide that feedback to CARB if there's any thoughts that you have on the Scope 1 and 2 reporting template or memo that was released earlier this month. And then the last update that I'll talk about today is the update that came out on October 14th. Originally, that was the date that I think some folks expected a notice of proposed rulemaking to come out from CARB, and they actually announced a change in the timeline where rules are now expected to go to the board in Q1 of 2026 with an exact date that has not yet been provided, but that would be Q1 2026 as opposed to mid-December 2025. In that notice that CARB posted that there was really a large volume of public feedback. As mentioned, they're trying to take on board all the feedback they're getting and make sure it's well incorporated and take that all into consideration. So CARB is going to take a little bit more time to get that process of rulemaking finalized. But despite this, we do want to emphasize from our understanding that compliance deadlines remain unchanged. You should still continue to work towards compliance on the deadlines that have been, communicated via the legislation. That doesn't change that. And ultimately, we do feel like you have sufficient information at this time to proceed with compliance based on what CARB has already shared. So we do feel like your company should feel hopefully well positioned to respond to the pieces of legislation and the compliance deadlines that are upcoming. So as I mentioned, CARB's been really busy. This is just a really small snippet of what we've interpreted CARB has been up to and kind of our key takeaways from those pieces that have been coming out. So highly encourage folks to take a look at CARB's website, as I mentioned. But given all of this, I'm going to hand it back to my colleague, Natalia, who's going to talk about kind of what it looks like to take all of this information on board to actually work towards compliance.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, as mentioned, trying to put a little bit more of the theory into practice here. I'll walk you through at a high level the steps that you might take to comply with these requirements as far as we see it from Agendi's perspective. So I'll start first with SB 261 because the deadline is fast approaching. So I want to talk about a streamlined approach to preparing a first climate-related risk report, especially given the shortened timeline that we have currently. So the recommended steps we would think of as threefold. First one is conducting a gap analysis and benchmark study. So this is where you would start by meeting with the individuals that are responsible for consolidating information and maybe even approving the disclosure report that will ultimately be published. And the goal here is to kick off the assessment, validate what's needed, and align on roles and responsibilities, making sure everyone's on the same page. You'll also want to gather information that you already have, whether it's publicly available or internal, to see what you might already have at your disposal when drafting the report. In many cases, you might find that you meet some of the disclosure requirements already and may not realize it, just given the information that you've already produced internally for other risk management processes. So doing a gap analysis between what you currently disclose or what you already have available and what the regulation requires, we see as a critical first step. Step two would be conducting a qualitative risk analysis and business impact assessment. As Samantha mentioned, the scenario analysis piece, whether quantitative or qualitative, isn't part of the minimum disclosure requirements, although we obviously recommend doing so. This specific streamlined approach is specifically for folks meeting that minimum requirement. So we strongly recommend doing a qualitative risk assessment as a precursor to the scenario analysis work that will maybe be required in the future. Which involves identifying and assessing both physical and transition risks and opportunities across the different time horizons, and then evaluating how those could impact your business operations, your finances, and your broader overarching organizational strategy. So this also might mean looking internally to your existing risk reports, externally to peers to see what's relevant to your organization. Okay, and then finally, the third step is about drafting the report and planning for future iterations. This is where you take everything that you've gathered in the first two steps, translate it into a narrative that is compliant with SB 261 and TCFD aligned. So think of this as the first edition, maybe around 5 pages. It tells your company's climate story in a concise and transparent way, making sure you're meeting the minimum disclosure requirements. And then from there, you can build a roadmap for how to improve and expand your report and future reporting cycles. The one thing that's important to note, and I'll mention on the next slide too, is that the public docket will open on December 1st, which is where the public report links need to be uploaded to meet the 261 compliance requirements. So as far as how this looks in terms of timeline, this can be and has to be completed within the next 2 months. The compliance deadline is upcoming on January 1st, 2026, which means you should start as soon as possible to be able to meet that deadline. We've put together a high-level timeline covering these first 3 steps that we talked about, indicating where we stand today, which is third week of October, assuming you start next week, going through the gap analysis and qualitative risk assessment between now and the end of November. The public docket link does open December 1st, but you have through the rest of the month to finalize that report and make it published by the January 1st deadline. Great. So now switching gears a little bit to SB 253, we recommend following a 5-step approach to get ready, especially if this is going to be your first greenhouse gas inventory. So step 1 is really around validating everything, so scope, stakeholders, and expectations. This is starting again by gathering the correct people, essentially those who are going to be responsible for collecting, providing, or reviewing data, and aligning on roles and responsibilities. This also includes determining your organizational and operational boundaries in line with the greenhouse gas protocol. So for those who are familiar with that, this means operational, financial control, or equity-based organizational boundaries. And then confirming which sources and facilities are in scope based on that information. This also is a good time to review what data sources you already have access to so you can streamline the data requests and avoid duplicative efforts, which is our next step. So step 2 is all about data collection. So you use the insights from the first step to develop a detailed list of activity data you're going to need across different parts of the business. This includes things like electricity consumption, refrigerant data, fuel use from any vehicles. And I will say I'm focusing on scopes 1 and 2 because that's what's going to be required for 2026. Scope 3 would require a lot more data and maybe extend that timeline. But for now, just focusing on scopes 1 and 2. Even within scope 1 and 2, you'll likely need to engage different internal teams to fill the information, fill gaps, and make sure that you have what you need. One maybe critical tip on the data collection piece is making sure that you're explaining why you're requesting the data to your stakeholders and how it's going to be used. Not only does this build understanding and trust between departments, but it also helps you get better data. We have definitely gone through multiple rounds of data collection where the data owners didn't exactly understand why. And once that clicked, it was way easier to have those conversations and get information that we were looking for. So highly recommend that. All right. Third step is around calculating and the emissions and undergoing quality assurance. So once your data is consolidated, checked, verified, then you can use this step to apply appropriate emission factors, follow best practice greenhouse gas accounting standards, like from Greenhouse Gas Protocol, for example, to calculate your scope 1 and 2 emissions. This process, you'll want to make sure that you're making very clear and documented um, processes for your methodology, your assumptions, everything. And ideally, you're also using a technology or program that allows traceable calculations. This is going to be especially important for quality assurance. Make sure you have multiple reviewers checking the data and the results for whether it's reasonable, confirming units, conversions, and flagging any anomalies before you get to third-party assurance, which is also a requirement of SB 253, and we'll get to in a couple of steps, but it's incredibly important for this. And step 4 is around developing an inventory management plan. So after you complete your calculations, I had mentioned being very detailed about how you're documenting everything, and this is where we recommend to do so as well. This is essentially an internal inventory management plan that's a comprehensive records of what methodology you use, what data sources, who is involved, what emission factors you're using, any key assumptions and gaps that you filled all in one place. The intention is that if someone else repeats the process next year, they'll be able to then reproduce the same results. It's also extremely helpful for auditors during the assurance process. And this is one of the first documents alongside the actual inventory that's being requested by third-party auditors. And last but not least is finalize, assure, and communicate. Right in this final phase, you're summarizing the results, identifying your emission hotspot, making sure that there are no data quality issues that might need attention in the future. And ideally, you're engaging your assurance provider early on so they can review methodology and your approach ahead of the submission. But once that assurance is complete, and any revisions are addressed that's needed, you'll be ready to then publicly disclose your results, for example, through CARB's reporting template that Samantha had mentioned. So, in far as timeline goes, these 5 steps map out, I will caveat by saying that timelines can vary very widely for greenhouse gas inventories, and it depends on things like how much data do you have available? How complex is your organization? What is the timeline of the third-party assurance provider you're working with? So while we can't give you a specific, exact timeline, we do see a range. For companies that often conduct this, it's a part of their business as usual. These assessments can take weeks. Whereas if this is your first assessment, it might take months. So just important to make sure that you're leaving enough time before the reporting deadline to not just perform the assessment, but also assure the results. What we've shown here is what we'd say is maybe an average timeline, acknowledging the caveats I've just mentioned, but it may take 3 to 5 months, including assurance, to complete your first inventory. So make sure to plan accordingly as some of this is out of your control. Okay. We've just provided a lot of information, and I already see lots of questions coming in. I do also see some questions coming in via the chat function. I would encourage anyone who has already put their questions in the chat function to please put them into the Q&A as well, because that's where we're going to be pulling the questions from. I appreciate everyone's active engagement so far. I will say we might not be able to get to every question, depending on how many there are, but we will try our best to get through as many as we can. And maybe a quick disclaimer up front, we won't be able to answer questions that are highly specific to your organizational structure. For questions like that, we would still recommend confirming with your legal team or counsel. We will do our best to answer all the questions that we can, though. So with that, let me actually stop sharing my screen so that you can see our faces. And I'll pull up the Q&A now. I see already so many questions in here, so much appreciated. Okay, I'll just start from the top and I'll flag Samantha and Pedro, who I think it makes sense to answer the question that we've received. So First question that we have is, when will we know for sure whether we're in scope? Maybe that's a question, Pedro, for you to tackle first.
Sure. Well, thanks, first of all, to Agendi for the invitation to be here in this workshop and to be able to answer some questions from the folks in the network. As you mentioned, we've been sort of curiously trying to, put out hopefully helpful materials to solicit feedback from the public, and then incorporating that feedback into our own thinking and into sort of new iterations of these materials. So I'm happy to share today the sort of our best, best understanding of sort of where things are and what entities can do to sort of be in compliance with SB 261 and or let's just say the 200s. So in terms of when companies will know for sure whether they're in scope. So in the first, these two most recent workshops, we put out some concepts for, thinking about whether, some of the definitions of revenue, of doing business in California, and of, whether a company is US based. We've gotten a lot of comments on those. We hope to sort of have some additional guidance this year still on sort of refining, those data sources and those definitions. But as we mentioned in our materials, ultimately it is up to each entity to sort of understand whether they're in scope. We put out that preliminary list with the best available data that we had, and we sort of understand that there's some gaps in there, both in terms of companies that we know should be included but were not included based on this data that we had. And then also, we have the survey so that companies that don't feel like they are in scope, they can let us know through the survey that that's the case. And so I think it's up to each entity to sort of make the determination. But we, like I said, in the coming weeks, we do plan to further refine those definitions so that you have a little bit better information to go on.
Thanks, Pedro. Hopefully that is helpful for the individual who asked this question. We'll keep moving on. We have a lot of questions in the chat here. So the next one is also for you, Pedro. What is CARB planning to do with the data that it receives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the 200s direct us to sort of collect this information, to partner with research organizations to analyze and provide sort of some like reports on sort of like trends of like what's being reported, and to make the data available to the public to inform investors, consumers, and other interested parties. So essentially there are sort of transparency bills, right, of sort of trying to sort of get this information out to the public. And so that's all we have planned to do with the data. And in the sort of specific areas such as our sort of contracts with researchers either from the UC or CSU system to do analysis and make that analysis public, that's just sort of, we're kind of following what the legislation directs us to do.
Thanks. If I could add like a little addition to this, because I've heard this come up in a couple of conversations I've had recently. I think there was a concern on, oh, how will we be compared against each other and what does that look like? And I think there's an area within the template that asks for example of the emission factors that you're using, the GWPs that you're using to maybe help alleviate some of that concern where there is differences in emission factors already, but maybe would love to just hear some validation from you on that piece as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the transparency here, I think the bills are sort of aiming at transparency, so aiming at getting this information about climate risks and about sort of value chain emissions out to the public. and then also being transparent about the methods that each entity uses to come to those
Mhm.
reports. And so I think that that will be sort of made publicly available. And so if the sort of the differences in emissions are related to different emission factors, for example, not necessarily to the actual emissions themselves, that should be very clear in the information that we make to the public.
Perfect. Thank you for answering that spontaneous question for myself. Okay, actually, I'm gonna come back to the one that's next, but I'm gonna skip one because we're talking about the SB253 template. I think that would be useful to discuss a little bit more. So the question here is, the SB253 template currently indicates that it is voluntary. CARB, how are we expected to share results if we choose not to use this template?
Sure. Yeah. So this is actually a good question to take a little step back and sort of compare 261 and 253, because I'm seeing in some of the questions and some of the feedback that we've gotten that there's some confusion around implementation of these two bills. So 261 is fairly prescriptive in the sort of it has the January 1st, 2026 deadline already in there. It sort of directs entities to use the sort of TCFD framework. And so it, in many ways, it's a sort of self-implementing bill, and sort of further regulation from CARB isn't required, right? So the bill directs CARB to do regulation for enforcement, for the fees, but the sort of the actual reporting, the sort of information that I think entities need is already in the bill. 253, on the other hand, does direct CARB to issue regulations that clarify certain things like deadlines and definitions and so on. And we are working on those, and that's coming next year. Just to be clear, that this isn't the regulation that that the sort of the time frame just changed, that went from December to Q1. This is a sort of a bigger regulation that will be going on for most of next year. But we haven't done that yet. And so we put out that scope 1 and 2 template as a sort of a helpful resource that companies can use as a sort of an indicator of our current thinking in terms of what would be eventually required through our regulation for scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting, although we didn't include 3 yet because scope 3 reporting isn't required next year. So that's all to say that we are not making that required now because we haven't done the regulation in order to make it required, but that's sort of what we're moving towards. And so this is I think hopefully a helpful resource for what we're thinking now, sort of the direction that we're going. We're pulling a lot of this from the GHG protocol, which is what SB253 directs us to do. And so yeah, so because we don't have a regulation in place, we don't require that, but that's sort of the direction that we're going. So I think that if there are other ways that entities have collected this information and can make it available to us, that we are not able yet to say that this is the only way to do it. But if you are doing it for the first time, or if I would say that this is sort of the direction that we're going. So it may be sort of helpful to sort of start thinking about your reporting and within this framework, which is what 253 sort of is guiding us to do.
Perfect. Thanks for clarifying. All right, going down to the next question is about scoping. It says, for a non-US company with operations in California, if we fall within scope of reporting requirements, here we go. If we fall within the scope of reporting requirements, should requirements be reported at the site level, California specific, the US level, or at the company-wide level? Think maybe, I mean, either can answer, but
Yeah,
maybe.
I'll answer that. So I guess there's two things I want to say about that. One is that emissions are company-wide, so they're not California-specific or U.S.-specific emissions. They should be company-wide. And then the other one is that if you're not a U.S.-based company, then you're not in scope, right? Unless you have a sort of U.S. Subsidiary that that is U.S.-based, that does business in California, that meets the revenue threshold. In that case, you'd have to report at the company-wide scale. But if it's a non-U.S. based company that doesn't have a U.S. subsidiary, then you are not in scope.
I saw Samantha, you unmuted, so I wasn't sure if you had any additional thoughts on that or if Pedro covered it all.
He covered it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Acknowledging a lot of these are CARB questions, I'm going to quickly do an Agendi question that has come up as well, a little out of order, but just to give you a bit of a break, Pedro. So the question is, we don't have much time left. How are we expected to meet the compliance deadline that was addressed to Agendi specifically?
Yes, I think maybe obviously, of course, there's the two different regulations, and I think as Pedro mentioned, they've kind of been lumped together a lot, but I'll kind of try to talk about them separately. So for 261, that deadline is approaching quite quickly, of course, January 1 of 2026. There admittedly isn't a lot of time between now and then. Time is flying by. But as Natalia mentioned in the presentation, like there really are some clear steps you can take in order to meet that deadline. We do think, in our experience supporting clients on this type of work, it's totally possible to do this in a 2-month time horizon. It maybe won't be like the most robust or very, very granular, but I think for like a first report, very doable in a 2-month timeline using the steps that Natalia outlined. I don't think there's a lot of time to waste in terms of getting started on that, but definitely feasible. You just do need to kind of start very quickly and be realistic about what you can achieve in a 2-month window in order to kind of meet what CARB is asking for, and leveraging that draft checklist that has the minimum requirements, I think is a really useful tool that CARB released to help support that. And then for SB 253, I do think, we do have quite a bit more time to be ready for that, knowing that you have until, as of right now, the proposed deadline is June 30th of 2026. So we do have a bit of time. You have tons of time. And so now the things you should be doing are, all the steps that Natalia outlined in terms of preparation, right? Like Natalia outlined a 3 to 5 month timeline for that. We definitely have well more than that, based on what CARB has shared in terms of potential timeline for scope 1 and 2 data submission. So you should hopefully have tons of time, but I do still recommend getting started earlier and sooner rather than later. You want to make sure you kind of have your ducks in a row on what you need to do, on making sure you can find the data that you're going to need, and to be honest, on finding an appropriate assurance provider. You're going to need to select a provider that you trust, that you feel confident in working with, and that is potentially going to be in very high demand as we get closer and closer to the compliance deadline. So plenty of time for sure on SB 253. SB 261, yeah, that deadline's a little closer, but we do still think that it's feasible to kind of get together what you would need to in order to put together a report that meets the requirements.
Yeah, definitely. One of the reasons why we put actual months and years in that timeline that we briefly shared is because we acknowledged how close it is to that deadline, but still think it is possible. And maybe just, Samantha, since you were just talking about selecting an assurance provider, that is one of the questions as well that was asked, is
Great.
When is a good time to start that process, and how do I even go about selecting an assurance provider? So I don't know if you want to add more to that thought.
Yeah, I can for sure add more to that thought. I would say start finding an assurance provider as soon as you're able to. Again, they're going to be in fairly high demand, and you want to make sure you have a relationship, ideally with an assurance provider, before you start your inventory. It'll be good to hear from them what they're going to be looking for when you go into the assurance process, and just make sure you're on the same page so that that assurance process can go more smoothly for you. In terms of selecting an assurance provider, there are a lot of options out there for this. It's a growing field in terms of getting your inventory assured. So lots of options. I think kind of very typically it's broken down between kind of like your big four style accounting firms that do this, and then maybe like more boutique firms that are very specialized in sustainability, and that do just sort of like inventory style assurance. And so, you know, if you can kind of decide what makes the most sense for your business. If you're a larger company, you've already got a relationship with a big four provider, maybe it makes sense to kind of stick with that because they know you already, they know your business. It'll be relatively easy to develop that relationship. If you're maybe a smaller company, the price point of a, you know, boutique sustainability assurance provider might be more what makes sense for you. So you know, lots of factors to consider, but again, I would start that process early so that you feel like you have a very confident and trusted relationship with whatever assurance provider you select. The only other thing I'll add here is that CARB noted in their August workshop that, from my understanding, they're not going to release like a list of approved or, you know, CARB accredited assurance providers. And Pedro, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but so you don't need to like wait for CARB to come out with a list. There won't be one. You need to go out and seek an assurance provider that will use a kind of very commonly accepted assurance standard or framework to kind of find what you need to get that done.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add to that you know, the sort of additional details for assurance for the future years, you know, will be part of this rulemaking that we're going to be undertaking next year. And so other CARB reporting programs often rely on CARB doing the sort of the accreditation of verifiers, and we're not planning to sort of get into that level of detail. And you know, as part of this reporting program, but there will be, you know, additional guidance, and then also a lot of opportunity for public comment during that rulemaking process next year. So if you have ideas or, you know, strong thoughts about that, please engage with us during that rulemaking process.
Perfect. Thank you both for answering that question. I think we'll have the next few questions for you, Pedro. First is, has CARB provided details on how to pay and or submit the fee for SB 261? I imagine maybe a similar question for SB 253 may come later down the line, so answering for both would be great.
Yeah, so that is the main focus of that rulemaking that is happening in Q1. So that's coming in Q1, and we'll provide additional details about that. And even though that's not a major regulation like the later one focused on SB 253 reporting, that also involves opportunities for public comment and public engagement. So we are open to that. During the last workshop, we did provide some details about how we are proposing to calculate the fee. You know, will be a flat fee structure that just basically takes the cost of implementing these programs and divides them between the reporting entities. So we're sort of continuing with that, and that will be a proposal to our board to adopt, but before that goes to the board, there will be opportunities for public comment.
Perfect, thank you. So more to come, essentially. Great. All right. The next question is a bit long, so bear with me. The proposed template asks for Scope 1 emissions to be broken out by source. However, emissions are typically tracked by location, not by source, making this requirement complex and costly. Moreover, major framework like EU's CSRD and Japan's SSBJ do not require this level of granularity. How should companies reconcile California's additional disclosure requirements with the goal of a harmonized global reporting standard? So maybe this is a question for you, Pedro, first, and then Samantha would love to hear your perspective, especially on the harmonized global reporting piece.
So our public docket for the template Scope 1 and 2 is still open. And so, this is probably an unsatisfying answer, but what I would recommend is for the person asking this question to submit this as a question, or if you have any thoughts about it, as a comment to our docket, because, we are that was our first stab at, putting out this guidance on Scope 1 and 2 reporting. We're going to take the feedback and sort of reiterate that and sort of have additional resources in the coming months. And so I don't want to get ahead of any of that. And so I really strongly suggest that you, it's a good question, and you submit that to our public docket along with any thoughts that you might have.
Yeah, I think just +1 to everything that you said, Pedro, in terms of, I think being able to provide that feedback, especially if you are a company that's reporting in other jurisdictions, so that CARB has that information clearly on hand, about how you are reporting your emissions elsewhere. I think that's really, really useful. I know something that Agendi has thought about in terms of like how to try to streamline this and make recommendations to CARB, from our perspective, is looking at voluntary submission frameworks like CDP that does ask for this type of information in terms of reporting. It's very much in line with what's in the CARB template that was released. So I think, trying to harmonize as much as is humanly possible is, of course, would be helpful, but also knowing there are some limitations to that, given that there's so many places to report information these days. But yeah, just seconding everything Pedro said in terms of submitting that public comment through the docket so that CARB has all the feedback and an insight that is available.
Perfect. Similarly to me, kind of going a little bit out of order, I scrolled down and saw there's actually a similar question about the scope 1 by source. I just want to flag that as well. I think the question is, goes beyond the scope 1 by source, goes beyond those generally reported under the greenhouse gas protocol or under ISSB. And so the question was, why was this added? I imagine that, Pedro, you'd probably have the same feedback to please write this as a point of or a comment within the public docket that's open until Monday. But was there anything else you wanted to add specifically for that question of why it was added?
We had internal discussions about the sort of what would be the most useful bit of information for the public, whether it was sort of the sort of sources or the sort of the type of gas. So that was a sort of a choice that we made specifically to get public feedback on. So that's why I'm sort of encouraging the asker or the person asking the question to submit that. Because and I think in the accompanying memo that we put out, we had a couple of things that we highlighted for that we're particularly interested in getting feedback on, and that was one of the questions that we asked. So thanks for raising that.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, going back in order. Question for Agendi. Could you reshare the list of items not required for SB 261 reporting?
Yeah, I will clarify this draft checklist that I mentioned is a CARB document. It is for first year reporting specifically. It could evolve in the future, so I'll add that caveat as well. But yeah, can make sure that folks have the link to that. Again, it's on CARB's website. Where I have mentioned before, but they have a lot of resources there that they've been working on. So we can make sure that as part of the follow-up, we include links to that so that everyone has access to all of that good material that's on the CARB website.
Perfect, thanks. And we will provide, just to add on to that, we'll provide the link, or not the link, the slides, and yes, the link to the webinar recording after this, which has resources within it, including that minimum checklist document that Samantha and Pedro are mentioning. So you'll be able to have that with you after the webinar. Okay. Another question maybe for you to start with, Samantha, and then have Pedro validate, but any thoughts on the SB 253 compliance? I think this means SB 261 compliance, actually, so I'm going to rephrase it, the question. Any thoughts on SB 261 compliance due on January 1st, 2026, and CARB's rulemaking now delayed to Q1 2026?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at that, and then yeah, we'll definitely love Pedro to jump in. But I think ultimately, as I mentioned, and as I think Pedro has mentioned throughout, what is in the body of the legislation for SB 261 does provide really a lot of the information that an organization would need in order to comply by January 1, especially with that draft checklist we were just talking about, to make it a little easier to understand more specifically, what CARB would be looking for in that first year reporting. So ultimately, my understanding of what would be in that rulemaking that would happen in Q1 would not necessarily impact an organization's ability to respond to SB 261. So you should still be able to do it. But again, I would love, Pedro, any additional thoughts you have to add on that?
Yeah. So I do want to say, if the person asking the question meant SB 253, January 1st deadline, just to really clarify that there's not a January 1st deadline for 253. The January 1st deadline is for 261 and it's set by statute. So CARB has nothing, we did not set that deadline. It was set by statute in 2023. So, hopefully when that happened, entities started getting prepared with, the legislation included guidance on the framework to be used, on the sort of the different definitions and thresholds, and so hopefully this the sort of getting ramped up to January 1st, 2026 for SB 261 has been happening for the last couple of years already. The rulemaking that's delayed to Q1 of next year, like I said, the primary focus of that is the sort of the fee program. So it doesn't really impact the reporting. And so the deadlines for 253, the statute says 2026 is the deadline for scope 1 and 2 reporting. At the last workshop, we sort of mentioned that June 30th would be the deadline for that, sort of as a proposal, and that we were really curious to hear from entities about sort of how workable that would be. And that's the thing that I don't have the sort of the list of comments in front of me, but my impression is that we got the most comments about that deadline. And so that's one of the things that we're sort of taking in and sort of talking about is what that deadline will be for SB 253 reporting. But again, 253 does not have January 1st, and it is 261 only.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that clarification. I had assumed a typo, but actually a very important clarification to make. So thank you, Pedro. Okay, acknowledging the time, and I'm just going to say up front, we won't be able to get to every question because we have over 10 questions left, and we only have about 5 to 6 minutes left. So I would encourage you to please post your questions as non-anonymous so we can follow up with you afterwards if you feel comfortable doing so. I know there are a few people who have left their comments as an anonymous attendee. Very much want to respect that. So if you don't feel comfortable, no need. But if you would like us to follow up with you after and we don't get to your question, would encourage you to repost them now as a non-anonymous attendee so we can do that. With that, we'll probably get to maybe 3-ish more questions. So next one is it okay to calculate in line with the climate registry, or is the greenhouse gas protocol the end all be all? Essentially, will we need to change our calculation methods to make sure it's in compliance with SB 253?
Yeah, and it looks like the next couple of questions are both about that, right? So we can maybe just take that on. So so that rulemaking that we'll do next year for 253 reporting will get into additional detail, and when we'll actually create a like more solid guidance here on how to report. SB 253 does direct us to sort of use the GHG protocol. Our intent is to be able to provide as much flexibility as we can for companies, but we also have certain legal standards that we have to meet for rulemaking, to clarity standards that sort of constrain our ability to provide flexibility in some ways. And so we do hope to be as flexible as possible to allow folks to continue to sort of do, if they're sort of already ahead of the curve and are already reporting, to be able to use the information that they're currently reporting to the extent possible. but we do have certain constraints that are related to rulemaking that are legal constraints that we have to follow, and we have to sort of be careful about that too. And so, that that's our goal, is to be able to provide flexibility. Again, this rulemaking next year is a public process, and so really encourage you to engage in that process. Voice your concerns about using the G2 protocol versus other standards that you may currently use, and so we can sort of take all of that in as part of that rulemaking.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, well, let's see if we get a chance for one or two more questions. Let's see. The next one I'll highlight is we have multiple US-based subsidiaries that might be eligible to report. Can we submit emissions under SB 253 at the subsidiary level, but report SB 261 at the global parent level?
So SB 219 provides that flexibility for companies to submit their reports on. They can decide whether to submit their reports at the parent level or broken up by subsidiary. To be honest, like we haven't gotten to that level of detail about whether, once you select one, you have to sort of do that across the board. So I apologize. I don't have a good answer for that. Like, we'll probably look at the legislation and see what it says. If it allows for that flexibility, then then I think that at least for this first year, I think my recommendation is to look at the legislation and see if you have to sort of like pick one and then go with that approach for both, for compliance with both. But I don't have a clear answer for that. I apologize.
Sounds like maybe this is another opportunity for feedback once that notice comes out in Q1. So, or before Q1, whenever that time is. Okay. I'll do one more question and then wrap us up because it's related to the subsidiary question. So I apologize, I'm going a bit out of order. Are subsidiary sales aggregated and attributed to the parent entity when determining if a parent company outside of California is in scope? Maybe this is also a Pedro question.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that we were thinking about it and that we sort of presented at the last couple of workshops is that we were kind of like thinking about it as sort of like a bottom up, right? Like you sort of go up and then you see if the subsidiary is in scope, then they have to report. And if the parent company is outside of California, they don't do business in California and they are sort of below, or either they don't do business in California or they're below the revenue threshold, then the subsidiary reports and not the parent company, right? So you kind of go from the bottom up, and then you sort of look at the revenues, at the sort of whether or not they do business in California, and you kind of like determine it whether or not you're in scope that way. I don't want to provide sort of direct feedback right now, like yes you are or no you're not in scope, but that's sort of like how we're approaching it is sort of like I said, from the bottom up.
Perfect. Thank you. Maybe also something that might bring more clarity in the Q1 timeframe. So with that, I think we probably don't have time to address any additional questions. We will reach out to the individuals that have posted questions non-anonymously to try to answer those as best as we can. Feel free to reach out to us directly as well. We'll give you our contact information after this alongside the recording and the slides, just so that you have everything that you might need. And I just want to thank you all so much for your active engagement, excellent questions. We hope that this session was insightful for you. Please look out for that email We would recommend leaving this with the key takeaways of what to prioritize over the next couple of months, which is to start working towards that climate risk report for 261 if you haven't yet already, and then start the data collection or data assessment process for 253, right? Get the folks in the room, see what kind of information you have already, who would need to be involved in the process once you close out your 2025 year. So encourage you taking those two actions away from this call with us, but really appreciate you taking the last hour of your time, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your week and hear from you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.